The High Renaissance is the most remarkable period in the history of art. How did it happen that in one place and at one time, four of the greatest geniuses in history emerge all at once? Is this an incredible coincidence or a natural pattern? And now we will figure it all out together. It is generally believed that the High Renaissance lasted only about 30 years roughly, from 1490 to 1520. By some incredible coincidence, it was during these years that Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo and Raphael lived and created in Florence, Italy. How did it happen that art awakened from 1,000 years of oblivion in Europe after the fall of ancient Rome, and specifically during these years? And as usual, to figure everything out, we'll need a bit of context. Once the Roman Empire was split into two. The Western Catholic part centered in Rome and the Eastern Orthodox Byzantium centered in Constantinople. The Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century AD and broke up into numerous European states, remaining Catholic in terms of religion. The Eastern Empire, which included Greece in its various forms, lasted for another 1,000 years. And in 1453, 30 years before the High Renaissance, Constantinople fell under the onslaught of the Ottoman Turks, and refugees from Byzantium flooded into the West, bringing a phenomenal gift to Europe. The works of Greek philosophers, considered lost and completely forgotten, soon stirred the minds of Italians and revived philosophy, which would lead to completely unexpected consequences. So what was medieval Europe like at that time, and what was the state of art? The Middle Ages are also called the Dark Ages, and I'm afraid that's the most accurate description of them. Everything in Europe was controlled by the church, and art was essentially at its service. Before the Renaissance, artists were exclusively craftsmen, whose main task was to decorate churches on commission from the church. All religious subjects were strictly regulated down to the smallest details. Each such fresco depicted a canonical story, and there could be no freedom or disagreement here. For example, when depicting the Mother of God, the proportions of the face, the size and position of the hands, and even the angle of the head had to be strictly observed. At the same time, there was no literature about art, and the very concept of art itself did not fully exist yet. And all the books were exclusively religious. They were written by hand and were very expensive, so there were no textbooks for any craft. Knowledge was passed directly from master to apprentice and from him to his apprentice. That's why the technique and style of painting hardly changed for many centuries. At the same time, the painters simply memorized standard poses and ways of depicting faces, mechanically reproducing them in exactly the same way each time. If the master taught how to paint a face, the student would copy it exactly. At that time, models were not yet used for any of the characters in the paintings. All the faces were painted by reproducing a single learned template. That's why almost all the faces in medieval paintings look the same. You can only tell the characters apart by their attributes and the colors of their clothing. In other words, there was no individualization or difference in the physical features of the characters in the paintings. Yes, it wasn't important. They showed a story, not people, a typical situation, not emotions. Subtitles by Dima Torzok. Realism and naturalness of figures, faces, and backgrounds were unimportant. All paintings from the Middle Ages before the Renaissance look like a two-dimensional puppet theater where identical flat cardboard people are stuck to a flat cardboard background made according to the same patterns. And then, in the 14th century, 100 years before the Renaissance, in Florence itself, Giotto di Bondone appears, who notices that something is wrong here. He notices the figures, faces, and clothing in the frescoes look unnatural, and, rather than just copying patterns, decides to use real people as references instead. That is, finally do what artists would do for centuries. This approach made his frescoes more lively and established him as the leading master of his time and a Renaissance forefather. I would even say that this made him the first true artist who set out to depict reality, to transfer a cast of the surrounding world onto the canvas. However, even in his paintings, notice that despite the advanced techniques of depicting clothing and figures for that time, the faces still remain inscrutable, almost identical and flat, and the poses are somewhat unnatural. The characters stand in a line, stepping on each other's feet, with no perspective. We infer their emotions mostly from their poses and the objects they hold. This period is called the Proto-Renaissance, the forerunner of the Renaissance. Giotto had many followers and students, but after his death, none of them managed to reach the same heights. Therefore, we will jump another 100 years ahead to the period of the early Renaissance, which dates back to 1450 years before the fall of Constantinople. Of course, the Renaissance did not emerge all at once, but gradually developed from Giotto's ideas, which were adopted by his followers, spreading the manner of realistic copying not only to the characters in frescoes, but also to their surroundings in the background. And this is exactly what brings us to the early Renaissance. The first painting considered to belong to the early Renaissance is the fresco by two artists, Masaccio and Masolino, called The Tribute Money, painted in Florence for the Brancacci family's chapel in 1425. A little earlier, a work by another Florentine scholar, Paolo Toscanelli, was published, called On Perspective. In this work, he described for the first time the laws of linear perspective, converging at a central point. An approach that seems obvious to us now, but was something new and groundbreaking in the 15th century, not intuitively understood. And look at the leap in quality that happened in just 100 years. In this fresco, the artist skillfully reproduced Giotto's approach to depicting figures, also using live models. But they went further. They applied this approach to the surrounding space as well. Look, people are no longer standing in a single line. They are spread out. The distant figures are proportionally reduced and their feet are placed higher according to perspective. But most importantly, here we see linear perspective for the first time. Look at the building on the right. Its lines meet at one point, forming a classic 3D space. The early Renaissance is defined by placing objects in images to transition from a flat plane to three-dimensionality, rather than arranging them in a single line. For us now, these things are so obvious. We all do this back in school, in drafting class. But it took medieval artists almost 100 years to understand the principles of linear perspective and to start reproducing it, finally expanding the depiction of space into depth. At the same time, there was also tremendous progress in depicting light and shadow. In Giotto's frescoes, facial shadows are still just along the edges, indicating the face's relief in the same way. Regardless of the position of the light source, here, notice the shadows are much deeper. They are applied depending on the position of the head and the location of the light source. Artists are not just trying to copy reality as accurately as possible, but also to make the image three-dimensional, both in terms of people and the surrounding space. Right after that, Masaccio created another fresco, the Trinity, and repeated his experiment in it. Look, here we see a quite natural 3D effect. The lines on the ceiling exactly replicate the arrangement and convergence of lines as if we were looking at them from below. For viewers of that time, it was perceived as a magic trick, like 3D movies were for us not so long ago. Early Renaissance artists, having discovered this effect, became almost obsessed with the idea of linear perspective. For them, it was like a miracle, an optical illusion, an incomprehensible trick to create a 3D effect and a sense of spatial depth on a flat surface. It was a completely new and extremely fascinating challenge for artists. Masaccio's obsession peaked with his creation of the lower trompe-l'oeil around the Holy Trinity he painted in Santa Maria Novella. Take a look at it. Here, the artist tried to recreate the perfect perspective of a dome. The columns here are painted in such a way as to create the full effect that they are real, that they are a continuation of the walls, and the figures look down at us from above. Paolo Uccello, a Florentine artist and mathematician, was so fascinated by perspective that he thought of nothing else. And he experimented with it in many paintings, the most famous of which is The Battle of San Romano. Here, to emphasize perspective, he arranges the weapons on the ground in a special way. And in the background, he tries to apply linear perspective to an extremely non-linear landscape. He doesn't succeed perfectly with the latter, but we still feel the receding space, even though it's missing a horizon. However, pay attention to the horses. The light and shadow are applied in such a way that they still make them look flat. Paolo Uccello, in his experiments on the fresco Presentation of the Virgin in the Temple, does something truly unimaginable. He brings linear perspective to the foreground. And it seems like a standard scene, but we see that the central place in it is occupied by the staircase, and the characters are simply integrated into its architecture. And already in the 1450s, Piero della Francesca repeats this in his Flagellation of Christ as well. Let's take a closer look at this fresco. Here, the composition is based on buildings, not people. People merely fill the empty spaces defined by perspective lines. The characters are split into two groups, with Christ's group shown smaller in size. But the main thing here is that he depicts light in a new way. He deliberately places the figures in different lighting situations. Notice that on the figures in the background, the light areas are on the right, where the light comes in from the street, while the front group of figures is lit from the left, where the sun is shining. This might not seem noteworthy to you. For us, it's natural. We've seen this effect many times in photographs. But for those times, when people were unfamiliar with cameras, such attention to light, such sharp observation was extremely unusual, I would even say insightful. But in fact, they already had a substitute for the camera. It was called the camera obscura and was a dark box with a hole. Light passing through the hole created an inverted projection on the opposite wall, the outlines of which could be copied onto paper. The camera obscura was known before that, but it was rarely used and mainly in science. It was reimagined and started to be used for designing his projects by the architect Leon Battista, who lived again in Florence and at that very time. And the invention was readily adopted by Renaissance artists who were already obsessed with perspective. The camera obscura became a technical intermediary between three-dimensional reality and the two-dimensional surface of frescoes. And now we are getting very close to the High Renaissance. And before we get to the most exciting part of today's lecture, a bit more context. We'll need it. All these incredible events happened in Florence. What was Italy like in the 1400s? It was a patchwork of small independent states, the most influential of which were Rome, Venice, Genoa, Milan, and Florence. They were constantly quarreling with each other, waging wars against their neighbors, competing for power, and engaging in internal strife. Florence was similar, but as a republic without a king and with a central location, it could easily trade with neighbors. And one more family that would change the world and art forever. In the 14th century, the rise of a Florentine family clan began, one that was involved in the textile trade and established itself right in the middle of the 15th century. A clan that would soon practically rule Europe. A clan whose name came from the word medico, which meant doctor. A clan that grew and became wealthy until it undertook its most ambitious venture, the opening of a bank in Florence in 1397. You've probably already guessed that we're talking about the House of Medici, which would soon become the richest and most influential house in Europe. By the second half of the 15th century, they already owned the largest bank in Europe. They put a couple of popes from their own family on the papal throne, became related to the French crown, and had almost all the overlords of Europe, the hunters, in their grasp. Before the costly conquests, for which they had to borrow money from the Medici. In other words, the Medici, without having an official title, were the most powerful and influential family in Europe, the purse of kings. Half of all Florence was involved in their business in one way or another. They de facto owned Florence. This lasted nearly 300 years. In 1434, the head of the house became Cosimo Medici, a highly enlightened man with a deep love for art. He would become the first patron in history, commissioning expensive chapel paintings and supporting the arts. If previously the only client for painting was the church with its strict canons and conservatism, now there was a new type of client, wealthy, generous, and at the same time extremely progressive and sympathetic. And 10 years after he came to power, the very fall of Constantinople that I already told you about takes place. And the works of Greek philosophers come to Italy. These treatises were a revelation for Italian thinkers. The lost humanism that permeated these works amazed the Italians. Medieval Catholic ethics and philosophy always placed God at the center of the universe. Man was a pawn, an insignificant being before divine greatness. But Greek philosophy, and above all the works of Plato, placed man at the center of the world. According to them, it is man who is the bearer of divinity, the conduit of God's will, but independent, possessing his own will and infinitely interesting. At that time in Florence, there lived a philosopher, Catholic priest and scholar named Marsilio Ficino. One of the few people in Europe who knew Greek, he translated the works of Plato and his contemporaries and thus became famous as an expert in Greek culture and classicism in the new human-centered system. This was so new and revolutionary that it instantly captivated the minds of the most advanced and educated class. Ficino played the role of a guide and popularizer of Greek philosophy in Italy and soon became the personal advisor and friend of the enlightened Cosimo Medici. And 20 years after the fall of Constantinople, in 1463, Cosimo gave one of his estates in Careggi entirely to Ficino, and he opened the famous Platonic Academy there. This institution wasn't a university or school, but more like a club for people with shared interests open to anyone, and immersed themselves in heated philosophical and ethical debates, developing humanist thought that moved further and further away from the darkness of the Medici Middle Ages. Botticelli, the earliest of the four great Renaissance artists, was also part of the Platonic Academy. The human body as a reflection of divine perfection is the humanist idea that captivated Botticelli, and after him, Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. Do you feel that something is brewing, that the high Renaissance is approaching? But even it would not have reached its full power if not for two more inventions. In 1450, a mechanism was invented that probably had the greatest impact on all of human development, allowing not only the preservation and transmission of knowledge, but also making it accessible to almost everyone. Remember, I said that the only way to pass on skills was through personal teaching, carried out by a master from mouth to mouth. So, in 1450 a device appeared that changed this centuries-old paradigm. The printing press was invented, making book production hundreds of times faster and cheaper. This allowed knowledge to spread faster and farther than ever before. The translated works of Greek philosophers were printed and reprinted, and their ideas became available not just exclusively to philosophers in a single copy, as was usual, but to anyone who could read and had enough money. This created the necessary vehicle for spreading the advanced ideas of humanism, which simply did not exist before the mid-15th century. And the second, no less important event, or even a group of events, which you may never have thought about, but which revolutionized painting, was the appearance of canvas and oil paints. Before the mid-15th century, paintings were done as frescoes or on wooden panels. And so, at the end of the 15th century, canvas as a base for painting appeared in Italy. This immediately changes things, because a canvas stretched on a frame is not a wall and not an expensive, finely crafted wooden panel. It's easy to transport, light, and most importantly, cheap. However, its size was limited by the width of the loom, which usually produced a strip of fabric no wider than 60 centimeters. That's why the two most common painting sizes appeared, 50 by 40 and 60 by 50 centimeters. For larger canvases, pieces of fabric had to be sewn together and then primed. And even now we often see a seam running through the center of the painting. Pay attention to this sometime. The canvas was also semi-transparent, allowing images to be projected onto it in the camera obscura, so outlines could be traced before continuing to work with the material. Leonardo often did this. Take a look at his unfinished works, where you can see the process. So, the appearance of the canvas created the prerequisites for the development of portrait painting and later all other types of painting which had hardly existed before. But the most important thing was the appearance of oil paints. Until the mid-15th century, tempera, usually egg white based, was the main paint used. Its liquid consistency made creating highly detailed images difficult. Oil paint, on the other hand, could change its thickness and transparency thanks to various additives. This created entirely new, unprecedented opportunities soon tested and used by Renaissance geniuses. Moreover, unlike fast-drying tempera, oil paints took several days to dry, which allowed artists to blend layers directly on the painting and easily correct unsuccessful areas, bringing the image to perfection, something that was completely impossible to do with tempera. Jan van Eyck first used oil paints in the Netherlands in the early 15th century. Antonello da Messina, who studied in Flanders, brought the recipe to Florence and improved the formula by adding lead oxide, which gave the mixture a honey-like consistency and improved its drying properties. This mixture was known as ogliocotto. Thus, by the middle of the 15th century, we have a unique situation concentrated in just 30 years, from 1450 to 1480 after 1,000 years of stagnation. The revival of Greek philosophy emphasizing the human body, along with the printing press, made sharing knowledge far easier. The emergence of oil paints, which provided technical possibilities that were previously unavailable, and canvas, which finally separated painting from walls. All of this fell on fertile ground, technically prepared by the experiments of early Renaissance artists with light and linear perspective. And of course, the last and perhaps most important factor is creative freedom, which during the harsh Catholic Inquisition only money could provide. And the protection of an all-powerful patron, the Medici family, and this protection was definitely not superfluous. The Dark Ages still loom. The crows are ready to peck out Prometheus's liver. But no soil by itself would produce seeds. At that moment, something happened that completely defied any logic. 4 unparalleled geniuses were born in the same place within just a few decades. The first to start was Botticelli, who was born in the year 1445. 8 years later, Leonardo da Vinci joined the race. Then 23 years after that, Michelangelo. And finally, 9 years later, Raphael. In 1483, by the time Raphael was born, Botticelli was already 38 years old. And these 4 artists lived at the same time in Florence, which had a population of 30,000 for almost 30 years, and they created art simultaneously for 12 years until 1510, when Botticelli died. From the moment Raphael's first significant work appeared in 1498 until his and Leonardo da Vinci's deaths in 1519 and 1520 respectively, there were 22 years of simultaneous creativity by these artists, which is considered the High Renaissance. And just think about it, what are the chances that 4 geniuses would emerge from a population of 30,000 people in one place? It's incredible. And at the same time, other great artists were creating in other parts of Italy. Giovanni Bellini, Giorgione, Titian, Correggio. It's as if some mystical art bomb exploded in Italy, and I will definitely tell you about each of them. These stories are just as fascinating, so subscribe to catch them all. But in this video, we'll focus only on 4 Florentines. In 1477, Pope Sixtus IV decided to renovate an abandoned old chapel in the Vatican. But the task was so massive that he hired 4 artists at once for the painting: Botticelli, Pietro Perugino, Domenico Ghirlandaio, and Cosimo Rosselli. The new chapel would be named after Pope Sixtus, the Sistine Chapel. The artists divided the sections among themselves, and in order for the painting to have a unified style, the 4 completely different artists had to develop a common approach. This would soon become the set of unwritten rules of the High Renaissance. They started in 1880 and worked on it for 3 years, creating 16 wall frescoes, and this laid the necessary groundwork for the High Renaissance. And the world was literally in turmoil. In 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered America. In 1898, Vasco da Gama sailed to India by rounding Africa. The world suddenly turned out to be much bigger than everyone thought. Absurd rumors spread, like claims that Earth is round and the sun revolves around it. Some heretic named Copernicus says such things. The world is shaken by discoveries. Scientists and philosophers are finding something new and incomprehensible around them almost every year. And of course, this can't help but influence progressive painting. However, the Catholic Church is not asleep. All this progress is a thorn in its side. It makes people free. Additionally, these artists now believe man, not God, is the center of the universe. The turn of the century is approaching, and all the clergy are traditionally expecting the end of the world, frightening parishioners with the Last Judgment, which will happen any moment now, unless, of course, they buy an indulgence. Inspired by this madness, Bosch creates his Garden of Earthly Delights, which I discuss in my video. Be sure to check out the link, I'll leave it in the description. And the Catholic Church sent the preacher Savonarola to Florence. You may have heard this name, who dreamed of morally and politically transforming the country. And in 1494, the French king Karl VIII attacked Italy and reached Florence, as a result of which it came under his control, and the Medici were expelled as traitors. Control of the city passed to Savonarola, who, on the one hand, began selling church property and distributing the proceeds to the poor, and on the other hand, started giving sermons during the time set aside for balls and masquerades. And alongside these sermons, huge bonfires were organized where everything sinful, tempting, and pleasurable was burned. They were called the bonfires of vanity. Among the items regularly burned in these bonfires of vanity were mirrors, cosmetics, exquisite dresses, playing cards, musical instruments, and of course paintings with nude bodies. Priceless Botticelli masterpieces were burned by his own choice, but more on that later. As you can see, only the powerful Medici's patronage and protection enabled painting to develop, improve, and experiment near prohibition. And as soon as the Medici's protection weakened, the dark clouds of the Catholic Church gathered once again. 4 years later, in 1498, Savonarola became so enraged that he began attacking the Pope himself, who didn't like his accusatory speeches that interfered with the collection of indulgences. And Savonarola was captured, tortured, and hanged, and his body was burned at the stake, the very same stake where he had burned paintings. After the fanatic's death, the Medici slowly regained power, but officially returned to the city in 1512. The year 1498, which is also when Raphael Santi painted his first work, is seen as the start of the High Renaissance. So, how was the High Renaissance different from the early Renaissance? It was precisely the newly acquired knowledge of Greek philosophers that dictated to the creators of that time a sense of humanism and anthropocentrism, namely the depiction of the human body brought to anatomical perfection, something that artists of earlier periods did not even attempt. The High Renaissance absorbed all the latest developments in painting, perspective, and the use of light, and it took the final step, keeping the focus on the human being, applying all the accumulated skill in working with light and shadow to the human body, which made it three-dimensional, alive, emotional, and dynamic. The beauty of the human body as the embodiment of divinity. Remember this motto? It is this motto that most accurately defines the approach and goal of the High Renaissance. And now, let's finally talk about the artists themselves. Each of them will have a separate video, but in this lecture, we will only briefly touch upon their fascinating destinies. Let's begin with the oldest one. Botticelli. In general, Botticelli is considered part of the early Renaissance because the peak of his activity came in the 1470s and 1480s, during which he created his most famous works. But in the 1490s, he came under the influence of Savonarola and abandoned his freestyle. His works became more austere, even didactic, and no longer fit into the paradigm of the Renaissance. However, I think it is right to mention him among the great artists of the Renaissance. Sandro Botticelli was born in Florence in 1445 to a tanner's family. He was 53 and already a recognized master at the time of the events. At the age of 19, he became an apprentice in Fra Filippo Lippi's workshop and studied under him for 5 years. And when Lippi left for Milan, Botticelli moved to the workshop of Andrea Verrocchio, where the young Leonardo da Vinci had become an apprentice a little earlier. From 1470, he began creating his own works and developing his style. In 1474, he received a major commission from the church and painted the picture Saint Sebastian. Around 1475, the painter created the famous painting Adoration of the Magi for the wealthy citizen Gaspare del Lama, in which, besides members of the Medici family, he also depicted himself. He became a renowned portraitist and painted prominent figures, including, of course, the Medici. As a result, he became close to the family and practically became their court painter. His fame spread to Rome, and in 1477, as you know, the Pope assigned him to paint the Sistine Chapel. He was well educated, attended the Platonic Academy as mentioned, and in the 1480s, his painting became more secular. He painted perhaps his most mysterious work, Spring, in which he mixed contemporary and Greek images. And in 1885, he created his most famous work, The Inimitable Birth of Venus, and continued to paint, until Florence was taken over by Savonarola. Unfortunately, he fell under his influence and burned his paintings that were still in his possession and gave up his free thinking. Botticelli becomes a fierce fanatic and follower of Savonarola and practically gives up painting. His fame fades, and he eventually dies in poverty in 1510. And now we move on to the second and perhaps the greatest creator, Leonardo da Vinci. He studied in the same workshop as Botticelli, but by nature he had a sharper and more inquisitive mind. He was a natural explorer who observed and sketched flowers, water movement, transparency, and gemstones, but above all, he was obsessed. He studied the anatomy of the body. With his own hands, he dissected more than 20 bodies to study the structure of muscles, tendons, and bones. In addition to experimenting with various devices, he also experimented with oil paints, adding different substances to achieve the desired effect. The experiments were not always successful. That's what happened with the Last Supper, which he painted in the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie Monastery in Milan from 1495 to 1498, while Savonarola raged in Florence. Watch more about this in my video about the Last Supper. I'll leave the link in the description. He was the one who brought the depiction of emotions and the human body to incredible heights that were unattainable before him. But his greatest achievement was the sfumato technique, which you can see in the Mona Lisa and the Madonna of the Rocks. This technique made it possible to create very soft, smooth color transitions thanks to many thin layers of translucent paint, which finally became possible due to creating elements with oil paints. He had many students, and he generously shared his knowledge with them, leaving perhaps the most powerful legacy in history. He died in 1519 at the age of 67, and his death is associated with the end of the High Renaissance era. See his story in an upcoming video. Well, now let's move on to Michelangelo. He was born in 1475 into the family of a respected Florentine notary, and at the age of 33 he was invited to complete the painting of the Sistine Chapel, the walls of which had already been painted by Botticelli. He was given the ceiling with 12 niches in which he placed the stories of the 12 apostles. In just 5 years, he covered the entire ceiling with paintings. In an unexpected and mesmerizing manner, he completely departed from all the canons and depicted not stories of salvation, as the church wanted, but stories of the shame of humanity. The figures in his frescoes look so realistic that, for that time, it seemed like a miracle. The most famous part of the central section shown on the screen is Adam's figure. It's so beautiful that people doubted it was made by a human. Seeing this, they believed Michelangelo's hand was guided by the Lord. The later painting, now on the altar wall called The Last Judgment, was created by him between 1534 and 1541 and was done in a different style which is called Mannerism, which replaced the High Renaissance. He died in 1564 at the age of 89, having lived a long and productive life. The last of the greats, Raphael, was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. In an artist's family in 1883, he did not contribute as much to the treasury of the High Renaissance as his contemporaries, but rather became the person who accumulated all the achievements of his predecessors. He studied under Perugino himself and painted his first picture at the age of 21. And already in 1508, while Michelangelo was painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, he was painting a series of wall frescoes in the Raphael rooms, as they would later be called, of the Apostolic Palace nearby. Among them is the fresco The School of Athens in the Stanza della Senatura. This fresco depicts almost all the most learned ancient Athenians. The central figure is Plato, whose prototype for Raphael was Leonardo da Vinci. But Michelangelo and the others didn't get along. A cold rivalry existed over the title of chief papal artist. But his main fame came from his Florentine Madonnas, small paintings in which he repeatedly depicted the Virgin Mary, slightly changing their poses each time. The most famous of these, of course, is the Sistine Madonna. She died at 37 from an unknown illness, just 37. With their deaths, the period of the High Renaissance comes to an end, a period of just about 30 years that concentrated the immense talent of three great artists by fate and destiny, all born and living in the same Italian city called Florence. The High Renaissance is replaced by Mannerism, which translates as excessiveness, where artists, having finally mastered depiction, do so in an overly dramatic way, almost like a Mexican drama. That's why it's called Mannerism, or the Late Renaissance. Next is the Baroque period, which will have its own video. Let's sum it up. Proto-Renaissance. This is a more realistic depiction of people in religious scenes, the first use of people as models. Early Renaissance. the emergence of linear perspective and realistic light and shadow, the first 3D high, Renaissance, human-centered painting, perfection in depicting bodies and emotions, early mannerism, excessive dramatization. The Renaissance arose and flourished in the impossible environment of Catholic prohibitions, becoming perhaps the first artistic rebellion, showing that people always strive for freedom. And the stricter the restrictions, the more explosive and impressive the breakthrough will be. Renaissance art, for many years until the middle of the 19th century, defined the development of painting, returning the central place in it to the human being as the unsurpassed vessel of divine beauty. An incredible story, isn't it? Friends, I have a request for you. I run this channel by myself, and each video is a huge amount of work, which is why they come out so rarely. But together, we are creating the best art channel on Runet, without a doubt. And your support would be very helpful to me. Please subscribe and support with any donation on YouTube, Boosty, or Patreon. I'll leave the links in the description, and thank you for watching. Bye everyone! And now, let's finally talk about the artists themselves. Each of them will have a separate video, but in this lecture, we'll only briefly touch on their fascinating lives.